now. So for today, we will be having a very topical panel on the impact of Sino-American technology competition. Joining us on stage today will be Robert Wright, a partner at Baker McKinsey, and also it will be moderated by Peter Kuo, managing partner at Canyon Bridge Capital. Joining us online virtually, we will have Jalal Bagherli, co-chair Williams of Advanced Engineering, chairman of PTSL, and Timothy Chen, head of sales and marketing, China CEO of VIA Technologies. And we'll also have Ariel Silberman, SVP Corporate Development at Valens. So could I invite Peter and Robert to come up on stage? Feel free to take off your masks. We are mask-free on stage today. Mask-free zone. Yes. Step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. So we got our panelists on. Great. Well, why don't I get things started here? First off, I'd like to say today's panel is going to delve straight into the heart of the geopolitics that are driving a lot of the tech industry today. And specifically, we're very privileged to have some of the leading figures in the semiconductor universe here participating, some very experienced veterans. And the focus of today's panel discussion will focus a bit more on this specific industry, both some of the trends impacting it, as well as clearly today, the geopolitics around it. And perhaps I'll start off with a quick intro of our panelists here today. We've got fantastic participation across the globe, as some of the earlier panels had as well. Then we got Jalal Bagherli from London dialing in. Well, I think, Jalal, you're in London. It looks pretty dark there, but I know it is winter. Yeah. Great. We got Ariel dialing in from Tel Aviv, I believe, and morning there as well. And then Tim Chen here in Singapore. Of course, we've got Rob and myself physically here in Hong Kong. It's great to actually be able to be maskless here. Maybe a quick intro here. With Jalal is, in fact, one of the great figures today in our industry for semis. He's a very accomplished CEO, currently on the boards of chair of two companies, Pro Testing Solutions, as well as Williams Engineering, focused on EV battery solutions. And prior to that, he was most recently the CEO of Dialog Semiconductor, which he sold to Renesas in Japan for nearly $5 billion in 2021, and remains very active in the industry today. We've got Ariel from Tel Aviv. He is the VP of Business Development at Valens Semiconductor. This is a high-speed communications chip company headquartered in Israel and focused on a global market opportunity. Ariel, in addition to his role at Valens, is also a senior fellow at Tel Aviv University in their Israel-China Policy Institute. And so we'll have some very insightful, I believe, remarks regarding the state of geopolitics from an Israeli perspective. And then we've got Tim Chen coming in from Singapore. Tim is the CEO of VIA China, one of the leading Asia-based semiconductor companies. He's also very active in the private equity universe and a partner at one of the largest, I would say, focused hardware semiconductor funds. And also, Tim is active in a number of other institutes, including the World Economic Forum as a young leader, as well as the Aspen China Institute. And then Rob, I should say, is from Baker McKinsey, previously from Australia, been in Hong Kong now, being involved in a number of multi-jurisdictional and cross-border transactions. So with that, why don't we get things started with respect to the state of the industry today? Because as anybody here following the technology space realizes, semiconductors, for those of us in the industry, had historically been perhaps a sort of behind-the-scenes, sleepier industry that was very critical. Everyone in the industry knew that, but has really exploded into the limelight in the last few years because of the nature of semiconductors at the heart of all technologies today and the importance of semiconductors in driving technological advances. And that has only been heightened by the state of the US-China relationships, which we know has become increasingly fraught, and semiconductors has become at the very heart of the US-China tech war. And many of us here, and we'll talk about it more in the panel, realize there's a lot more restrictions in place, both with respect to doing transactions, but also with respect to export controls. And this is also happening at the same time we're going through a significant downturn in the semiconductor industry, the first in quite some time. The Philadelphia Semiconductor Index is down 30% for the year. There have been, in the past week, significant guide downs of the semiconductor revenue for the next year. At the same time, some of the leading companies in the world, TSMC, of course, comes to mind as perhaps the single biggest semiconductor company now, as well as Intel in the US. They continue to be very bullish about the prospects for the industry in the next 10 years. So with that backdrop, Jalal, maybe I'll ask you to start first, because you've certainly seen as many cycles, if not more than anybody here today in the semi industry. Do you think this is a cyclical, traditional semi downturn, or do you see this being a little bit different given the state of where the world is today from a geopolitical standpoint?
I think it's a probably a combination of both, but I mean, we had phenomenal growth during the COVID dominated era in the last 2-3 years. 40-50% growth a year for an industry which is quite mature now. It was phenomenal growth, and as you said, only recently we've seen the year-on-year numbers started to looking negative, particularly driven by memory. But analog and other areas of the market is still strong, but they will be going down. No question. There's the downturn is in everybody's outlook into Q4 and into next year. I don't think this is necessarily now geopolitics. I think is reacting to the recession, and we will go through a cycle of down, as we have done multiple times in our history. But I think is nothing to I guess worry about, in the sense that semiconductor industry drives the rest of the world in terms of innovation and feeding into both consumer, automotive, medical, defense, everything. So there is no underlying threat to the industry as existential threat. It will be huge and it will continue to grow. So I know you said the Intel and TSMC are talking bullish for the long term. I think they ought to, because there are no alternative to that. Now, how the growth is going to manifest when we come out of recession, and how is that impacted by geopolitics? That's a different question. So that the upturn normally is that the people like TSMC and Intel investing capacity for the rest of industry. Is only 3 or 4 companies that normally can invest in terms of wafer fab capacity because of the size of the investment required. But going forward, we now have this overlay complexity of geopolitics, that's onshoring and investment in, if you like, islands of operation becomes more dominant. So we see a lot more fabs invested in the US, with the CHIP Act sort of supporting $52 billion of investment into semiconductors, mostly for attracting manufacturing like TSMC, Intel, Samsung. Many others are actually investing in Arizona, Texas, and also state of New York are the more prominent ones. And then in Europe, you have almost equal amount of money from EU, the CHIP Act, which is around $50 billion equivalent, and that started to invest in people like ST joint venture with Global. Infineon expansion, and also Intel expanding in Germany. And there are rumors that TSMC will also set up fabs in Europe, to be seen. But indigenous companies are investing heavily in building new factories. For example, Bosch, which people wouldn't consider as a semiconductor company, is actually investing heavily in building further fabs. They've always had fabs, but they're now building a lot more. And ST Micro also building separately for silicon carbide a new fab as well. So I think that in Europe it will be primarily for auto industrial type market, and for US, it would be more for bleeding edge gaming and server type sort of technology.
Thanks, Shaw. I think that's very helpful context when we think about how much money is going into the semiconductor space. And that's in part, of course, because of the nationalization where the need to become more self-sufficient. But perhaps, Tim, I turn it to you from a Asia perspective, given how active you are looking at companies across the board in the Asia Pacific region. What do you think about the state of the China semiconductor market in particular? It's, of course, as we know, the largest semiconductor market in the world. At the same time, it's being buffeted by a lot of the US pressure and export control restrictions. Nevertheless, it's perhaps been the most prominent proponent where China has of supporting the industry through significant investment and subsidies. And how do you think that counteracts what's going on right now with the economy in China?
Okay, but Peter, before I answer your question, let me address what Jalal was mentioning. In fact, I agree with him. And then I'll talk a little about that and then talk about China in general, or in my opinion. I think if people asked me a couple of years ago if anyone could predict inflation in the US, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, or what's happened, if you look last year from a chip shortage, all of a sudden to resulting right now in what I call an overbooking, I don't think anyone could really predict that. That's one. But the things I think are inevitable is the mega trends of digitalization. Whether it's we move from the mobile internet now to IoT, AI, AR, VR, automation, I think we're addressing not only a sizable market, a massive market. By 2025, industry estimates over a $700 billion market. Now, are we in the ebbs and flows of a down cycle right now? Yes. But the macro trends show that digitalization is here, and will continue to grow. Now, how does that affect, or my opinion on China? First, if you look at semiconductor imports into China, starting in 2014, the imports of semiconductors into China has surpassed that of crude oil. And why is that significant? Crude oil was the largest import into China. So what we're seeing right now is like what the economist said before a couple of years ago is maybe right now we're seeing a fight for the world's most critical resources, right? What economists said was chip wars, America, China, silicon supremacy. And you're seeing this mega trend of self-sufficiency, or what I call high-end self-sufficiency in the US and Europe, in areas such as Japan and Korea. And yes, US-China relations are lowest point in decades. But that is not just a recent phenomenon. That is starting 2018, all the way to 2019 with Huawei added to the entity list, to the so-called foreign direct product rules in 2020, all the way to now the BIS restrictions that started in October 7, 2022. But how do I see this? I think if you talk about China, you also have to talk about the US. And because there are two parts of the same equation. In my opinion, the US wants to retain its technology lead to protect its commercial interest in China. That's one. The other one is, and what Pat Geisinger said a couple months ago, is that this is not just about restoring US competition, bringing back this mantle from Asia on a critical industry, not only for our economy, he said, but also for our national security. So as Jalal was saying, the US will win the likes of TSMC and Samsung. You see TSMC building a fab, $12 billion by 2024. You see Intel in Arizona putting $4 billion to work. Samsung by 2023 will have deployed, or plans to deploy $17 billion US dollars. So how do I see this? First, Premier Xi a number of years ago said that the semiconductor chip is small, but it's very, very important. In Chinese is 芯片虽小，却是果子中期. So you've seen those effects now in the 14 5-year plan. That happened in 2020. There were a couple of key areas, EDA, key semiconductor equipment. I won't go through it, that they focused on. And if you look at this, not only at a central level, but at the local government level, is ramping up semiconductor support. And if you list out the cities, just off the top of my head, Beijing, Shandong, Jiangsu, Shanghai, Zhejiang, Fujian, Guangdong, you say, oh, these are the coastal cities. No, it's in Shanxi, Hubei, Sichuan, Anhui. And what we're looking at is that China has made noticeable progress in several sectors. But is that in the high end or in the low end, a mature process going forward? And if you look at just last year alone, There were 28 additional fabs last year that China kicked off. So if you look at that, all these things, I think what you're seeing is what I call global semiconductor realignment. 1950s, 1960s, you had Intel and Fairchild. The 1970s, you had the rise of Japan with a driver like Sony. 1980s, you saw Samsung. Then you saw the Taiwanese, myself included, being the benefactors of PC outsourcing and the rise of TSMC. To me, I think it's an evolutionary process for different countries to have self-sufficiency or a build-up of a semiconductor ecosystem. Because, and I'm biased here, semiconductor is not only new oil, it has been a critical part of our industry, for the whole TMT industry, for decades. I don't know if that answers your question, Peter.
Yeah, I think that certainly summarizes the heart of what's going on politically today. And we're seeing how everyone is striving for self-sufficiency. And maybe that's a great segue, Ariel, for you, from your perspective, being in Israel, which is in some sense caught in between two very large giants, between the US and China. Israel has always been an innovator on the technology side. What are you seeing from a let's say, semiconductor war overall tech perspective with respect to how Israel is viewing its own role with respect to some of the realignment that Tim mentioned and some of the political trends that Jalal had alluded to?
Well, thanks. I appreciate being here and appreciate this question. First, let me echo what Tim and Jalal were actually saying. I think I agree with both of them on many of the things. To put a little more context and perspective, the Global Semiconductor Alliance showed numbers this year of the number of fabs that are being in some degree of construction or planning, and they put it around 140 fabs in various degrees of planning and construction across the world. And if you look at that, like in just an average investment of $10 to $20 billion per one, we're looking at an aggregate investment across the world, like somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 trillion in this sector. And to put that in perspective, that is more or less equal to the investment in the energy market last year, not consumption, like energy drilling and searching. That's the same number. And to put it into even broader historic context and perspective, I think this is by far the largest and most expensive human endeavor. If you look at the Manhattan Project in the 30s to develop a nuclear weapon, that cost $2 billion then. Corrected for inflation, that would be like around $30 billion. If you look at the Strategic Defense Alliance initiative, what was known as Star Wars, that cost $30 million in the 80s. And corrected for inflation, that would have been like $150 billion. So to put this in context, the investment in semiconductors is so gargantuan that it really is by far something that would be very, very hard to stop. And given cyclical nature of markets and everything, I think we can be very bullish on the long-term importance and value of semiconductors. Now, as you pointed, Israel is indeed sort of lodged between two giants that are now in the middle of tensions and trying to compete with each other. And Israel really needs to see where its innovation is going to. Is it flowing east, west, or both? And we're experiencing increasing pressure on this front in Israel. And I think many companies, if not the majority of them, are actually sensing that pressure on their day-to-day life, having to make decisions. Where will you manufacture? Do you have a plan B for manufacturing in case something happens in the region and their sensitivities are increased? And this is something that you see across the board, that customers in Europe and the US will be asking companies in Israel, we understand your manufacturing and your procurement process now, but what is your plan B in case something happens? And no one knows what this plan B may be, but these things tend to have a self-fulfilling element to them, that once your procurement and your planning starts needing to look at option Bs, then like these things, they tend to sort of happen on their own volition at some point. So this is something I think will have significant impact on the innovation part of the market, where companies in Israel and other kinds of economies that are highly innovative, will start looking at potential options for Plan B manufacturing, and that will be related to the geopolitics, I think, very, very dramatically. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe, Ariel, if I could probe a little bit more on that. Given there's historically been a fair amount of China investment into Israel, how are you seeing that flow today, given some of the trends going on geopolitically? And then perhaps, Rob, if you had some of your perspectives with respect to what you're seeing on investments from a corporate lawyer viewpoint.
Yeah, so gladly, I'll answer that. I think it would be naive to say that there's no effect on Chinese, an impact of Chinese investments. The new regulations and export controls and demands and restrictions coming from the US are definitely having an impact, because small companies, larger companies, they all really have been seeing investments, from micro investments to large investments from China. And I think this will put more scrutiny across the investment world in Israel. And I think that the noisier and louder the US statements and restrictions are, I think companies in Israel will start being more cautious and hyper cognizant of where they take investments from. And in that sense, I think it's something that we've really never seen before, that even at a small startup level, people are beginning to develop a political and geopolitical awareness, which is something, the last thing you would have thought a young 21, 22-year-old innovator would ever think of when he's entrepreneuring and starting a company. And now these people are actually aware of it, and they need to put this into their calculus. Where does my money come from? And that is something that is, I think, new and will probably stay with us for quite some time as these tensions rise between the two powers.
Yeah, Ariel, I think it is a challenging environment, certainly for cross-border M&A. I think, as you're sort of suggesting, Peter, I think the risks continue to be sort of fragmented, and as regulation sort of catching up with the geopolitics that we've been discussing. I think probably some of the deals that look like they are straightforward technology deals that wouldn't necessarily hit the radar of the regulators are now right in their sort of crosshairs, right? Look at the Nexperia acquisition of NWF recently. It's a great example, right, of what was considered a reasonably old technology that was effectively blocked by the regulators based on some US regulatory involvement via the UK. And that's sort of, I guess, an example where we're seeing increased regulatory interest across markets, and really leading to sort of further protectionist viewpoints from different jurisdictions. CFIUS is one kind of angle that we're seeing played out for now several years. But interestingly, I think, Peter, as we were discussing earlier, sort of seeing an interesting development by US Congress and the administration around sort of the inverse of those regulations, which look to restrict potentially investments in technology and technology transfer in China and other jurisdictions, which again play to this protectionist sort of viewpoint. It's not just US China interest, as I think Ariel's highlighted. It goes beyond that now into the example in the UK and indeed a couple of recent examples in Germany that we've seen kind of restricting investment in those markets. So incredibly complex area, I think, as we all know. But I think interestingly, some of the other panelists were talking about this on the first panel today, and I think where there are challenges, where there are issues that we're seeing play out, there are also opportunities, and I think probably we can talk about those as well.
Sure, thanks, Rob. I think you've highlighted where there are so many regulatory and political risks today, and this next question is really for Jalal and Tim. You are both on the boards of several multinational companies that touch upon operations in all of these jurisdictions that we talk about. How are you thinking about political risk with respect to the companies and their strategies today? And in particular, we have, of course, seen this trend of reshoring or friendshoring, given the nature of how tightly coupled China is with the US and Europe for that matter. How realistic are any of these goals when you do planning for your own companies?
So I guess the companies I'm involved with now are probably less exposed to China. I don't think there's any getting away from, at least in the short term, the fact that if you are playing in semiconductor world, you gotta be in Taiwan. That's for sure. A lot of the ecosystem for most of the companies I've been involved with is based around TSMC or UMC in Taiwan for wafers, and then very major assembly and test sites are based there, like people like ASC or SPIL in Taiwan, amongst many others. So I think that is becoming more of a issue of sort of geopolitical thinking of what happens to stability of access to Taiwan as a center of manufacturing. All the investment that we talked about in the US and in Europe just now, they tend to be focused on wafer fabs. There isn't really the same zeal to build onshoring for assembly and test and logistics and warehousing as much. So I think even if you manage to switch your source of wafers to TSMC US or Samsung in US or somebody in the US, you still have to really be cognizant of the fact that majority of advanced packaging and test and scale up operations have to go through Far East. Not necessarily just China, but you have a lot of capability, as I said, in Taiwan, in Korea, Philippines, Malaysia, etc. So many of the European, and if I speak about European sort of based supply chain, so you could build in ST Micro or Infineon or many of the European-based fabs, and going forward, we get more advanced technology being invested in the fabs here, as we said. But they still need to ensure the access to the ASAT capability and volume capability in a scaled-up fashion, which only exists in Southeast Asia. So that's the way. And I think before, if you place the commodity type semiconductors to a side, things like memories or other maybe lower technology type stuff, anyone who's building an SoC of any form of advanced sort of capability with high pin packages and advanced lithography, they tend to use one source for their wafers historically, because it's so expensive to run an advanced product in multiple process technologies. They're not compatible easily. It's possible, but it's very expensive and time consuming, and particularly for startups, they can't afford and they don't have the capability to engage with multiple fabs to design their first product or second product. And that is not something that people have to put on their agenda and think about, okay, so yes, maybe my first prototype comes from, Taiwan, can I have a second one coming from Korea or Japan or US? So, there must be a second source in order to answer the question that you raised, because the investors will be demanding, what are you going to do? There is geopolitics going on. What are you going to do if I invest more and you're scared? We can't be exposed to just one supply chain. And this applies as much to a big company like Apple, and as well as now to startups. And as you say, entrepreneurs now have to think about geopolitics. And on that point, by the way, I have a direct experience of, offering a China-based company who wanted to invest in a European startup. And they said, no, we just, we're too scared. Our other investors want to co-invest if we take Chinese money. So you're right that the entrepreneurs of very, very young age have to now consider geopolitics in their day-to-day sort of fundraising as well as product planning.
Let me echo Jalal's statement. So in the past, I used to tell people that if you're in Hsinchu Science Park in Taiwan, you throw a stick, you hit a guy in the head, that person most likely was an engineer. Right now, in all the boards of the semiconductor companies if you throw a stick and hit a board member, in the last 2 or 3 years, they have become geopolitical analysts and lawyers. I think if you sit down, the first question that people ask is, what is BIS? And I think every board member now and every seminar will know what are the BIS regulations. They'll tell you it's 4 new ECN codes, 3 so-called FDPR codes, 2 new restrictions, a UVL list. They'll talk about the wider scope of export controls. They'll talk about how the entity list was expanded in areas of communication, national security, AI computing, and performance. I think that's something that every board member now, and pretty much every CEO and every executive in everything is fully aware of right now. But when Jalal was talking about Taiwan, just to give you a high-level number of the so-called public list goes around the world. Taiwan has 241. Korea has 168. China has, 100 plus. The United States has 97. In my viewpoint, the semiconductor ecosystem is an inseparable separation. You'll be pulled in different directions, but and how that's going to be navigated is going to be a challenge for every executive going forward. Jalal was talking about foundries being built in Europe and the US. Well, you mentioned something quite critical about OSAT. What about packaging testing? Are you going to fab the product in the US and ship it back to the Far East, and then ship it back to where? To which factory? That's one area. Second thing is, what about the talent pool? UMC and TSMC in Taiwan roughly is about 110,000 people. My back of the calculations for Intel just in Arizona, Idaho is 80,000 people that they may have to newly hire in the next 5 years. How's that going to be resolved? If you talk about diversification in Southeast Asia, in terms of the OSAT areas, how's that going to play out? Those are questions that not only deal with geopolitics, but talk about supply chain, talent pools, education in these areas as well. Is it that easy? I really don't think so. I think it's extremely difficult issues that we need to going forward, right?
Yes, and I think this is the reality of when you face the so-called decoupling, just how practical it is to do that. But perhaps when you think about it from where the trends are going, Jalal, you mentioned at the beginning, the U.S. is allocating the CHIPS Act $42 billion. The EU has announced, I think, something in the order of $43 billion to support those industries. And I saw today, Jalal, you posted that Cisco is opening a chip design center in Barcelona.
Right.
Do you see these as backup plans, or you see these as really part of the thrust of some of the strategies of companies going forward? And this is probably a question for all the panelists. But also, how realistic is it? What do the panelists think the U.S. and the EU is trying to accomplish with all this money, or is it simply more than anything a political statement?
I mean, I think it's partly political. They have, they shovel-ready money. So a lot of companies take advantage of lowering their costs by, for example, setting up a design center in Spain if there is, massive government sort of assistance locally, and also access to talents. To the point made earlier, if you can, get access to that talent in, say, Spain or somewhere, but also being paid to train and be based there, it makes economic sense. But I think I find the whole onshoring beyond the COVID logistical issue, etc., is probably now a exaggeration, because I think the supply chains are getting back to more closer to corresponding to demand. And my theory is, by the way, before we had the market forces determining how many fabs should be built for TSMC global. And now we have the kind of politics of onshoring, adding another 100 billion or even more to building local fabs, right? And none of these are based on market demand. So I foresee actually a golden era for startups or fabless companies, because all these fabs, once built, they will have massive, very, very expensive equipment that will be depreciating months and months. So the fabs will be chasing startup and smaller and fabless companies to offer silicon once more, and going back to the trends and maybe exaggerated trends of the past, rather than what we've seen in the last 2-3 years, where it was easier to get blood out of stone than a new wafer from TSMC or Global. So there are interesting dynamics also, which is driven not out of economics of the market, but also politics of the these new investments.
Peter, my opinion is that geopolitics doesn't need to make sense. I mean, world history has shown us that time and time and again. But I echo what Jalal is saying. All these foundries are being built. To me, it's a positive sign. And people say, well, TSMC reduced their capex this year. Okay, they reduced it from 40 billion to 36 billion. What was it 6-7 years ago? 10 billion. Then you see Samsung and the Korean government say they're going to deploy $400 billion in capex in the next 5 years. Like Jalal was saying, the US is putting $50 billion in the CHIP Act. The EU is doing the same. In many ways, I think that creates a plethora of IC design startups that can start to bloom and flourish. Just for example, a couple of years ago in China, there's maybe 3,000 plus IC design firms. During this period, that number has risen to 10,000 IC design firms. And if you look at the US, I remember in the 80s and 90s, there were a number of IC design firms. Now in the US, you see, among my hands, you can maybe count all the big ones. And then they're either really big semiconductor firms or really small. Maybe that evolution will have more and more of these IC design firms in the US and EU. How is that not a good thing, in my viewpoint? 10 years ago, if I tried to make an offer to any of the top schools to join an IC design firm or semiconductor ecosystem, frankly, no one would even give me a call back. In the last 2 years, I see a change. I see a change where people are willing to join semiconductor firms. So as Jalal was talking about golden era, I feel a golden era is incumbent upon us. I mean, it may look bleak and there's maybe challenges, there's geopolitics, but from my perspective, I feel a point where myself being a former engineer in this space, somewhat getting back some respectability, if you know what I mean.
I can chime in here. I think there are a few vectors that are pulling in different directions, but I agree in general with Tim and Jalal on the long-term prospects of the industry. I fully agree. I think we need to take into context two opposing vectors. One is that we cannot ignore the impact of the geopolitics and the international environment that leading countries and industries to seek self-sufficiency in many ways. Food security, energy security, and technology security. That is one of the lessons that I think the world is learning, a very painful lesson through the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the energy impacts of that. And I think the world is being driven to a lot of self-sufficiency strive when it comes to, again, food, energy, and technology. So in that context, I think semiconductors have almost become a status symbol. Can you manufacture semiconductors on your own? And that's driving a lot of these investments, and it turns into politics and national security and national pride. And that will be driving, and having said all that, I think there will be challenges because, as many people have foreseen, we may go to a glut at some point when there are so many foundry services available But I agree with Jalal and Tim fully that that would be good because it will drive a lot of innovation and a lot of opportunities for fabless semiconductor companies. So I think it's really, you have to look at the whole picture, that it looks problematic right now. It looks very challenging, and the geopolitics are putting a lot of strain. But in the long term, I think the world is going in a very positive direction with all these investments, and will really be driving the next generation of innovation in the semiconductor world.
Just to jump in on that last point, I think, from a transactional perspective, there are some I think green shoots and some positive signs that we are seeing, whilst challenging. I think, as we all see, there are ways of structuring transactions to limit your governance rights or information rights that can come in from investment from regions which may be challenging. I think that the expectation, speaking with clients investing in this space, is that there are ways of working around some of the restrictions, whether that is through sort of new structuring of investments, but typically sort of mitigation agreements that can allow for investment. But it's certainly a challenging landscape, and the investment from regions other than China, the US, Europe. You look at South Korea, $50 to $60 billion of investment, creating opportunities for companies like Samsung and others to collaborate and create opportunities which may not be equity investments, but other types of strategic alignment, I think, which we're also seeing play out, across border type arrangements, which are quite interesting, and I think create opportunities for growth.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think that's some of the opportunities you had mentioned earlier. As we're running low on time, maybe just to have the panelists wrap up, we'll play a little bit of punditry here. Given there's just so much involved with predictions and politics with this particular industry, maybe we'll go through with each of the panelists. Where do you see the state of the industry with respect to these political tensions in the next 5 years? Continued tightening and a heightening of the tensions, where it's some sort of uneasy settlement of status quo?
So can I start first, maybe?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think I see, I think the tensions will calm down and settle in some certain patterns. And I think, once we're through the height of that, we probably will end up, though, with some segregated spheres of global operation. I don't think this industry is such that you can do on a nation-state basis. The expertise, the range of complexity of the supply chain is such that is built over the years in different parts of the world, and to have a realistic ideal of trying to put things into one particular geography, I just don't think is possible in the short term, and I don't think it's not even economical or advisable. I think you, as I said, you will probably end up with some sub spheres of global operation, meaning probably a lot of the high-tech aspects of access to maybe latest technology will happen between US, Europe, Japan on the one hand, and maybe China and other countries on other, but you still need access to lower levels of technology, which is common denominator and available to everybody, and that could be access to rest of supply chain in terms of assembly, operation, or logistical management of what you're trying to do. But you'll end up with islands of collaboration rather than completely global collaboration. So that was one thing I foresee. The second thing is what we discussed, which is somewhat glut of semiconductors, which are, from a manufacturing point of view, is built way beyond market demand today. It will be completely used, by 2030 maybe, but I think in the next 2-3 years, we will see a glut of unplanned capacity coming online, which is not regulated by market demand by nature. So that's the second thing. The third thing I see is, I think there would be probably as you know, I'm sure our colleagues in the deal making in law firms and investment banking are very, very creative in coming up with the way that capital can be deployed from all regions, in the sense of minority stakes in company, as was mentioned, with some form of restriction. But I think the source of funding from Asia can, if it can couple with access to, for example, manufacturing know-how, that would be very useful for some small company in Europe, right? So it's not just funding, but it also it would be compelling because it would give access to knowledge of manufacturing or supply chain or logistics. So it won't be pure capital, but it would be strategic capital from Asia. So I think there is room for that type of deals to be done too.
Great. Any other comments from the other panelists as we wrap this up?
Gladly. I'd like to share one final thought. I think we're witnessing a really big shift in the world from the trend of the last few decades of globalization. I think most people can identify that the trend of globalization, which was linked to an underlying notion of a decrease in conflict in the world that enabled globalization, I think that has really come to a stop and is even reversing. And we're seeing the revival of alliances and partnerships at the expense of globalization trends of the last few decades. And that comes together with very extensive investments of capital from Europe, the US, and world over. And as we see the fusion complete between technology and geopolitics, that now technology is a yielder of political power, just like oil was a yield of political power in the 70s and 80s, then I think we need to let these trends play out, and there will be some form of separation, and after it calms down, as Jalal says, we'll start seeing islands of collaboration based on a different political and geopolitical paradigm, perhaps. And in that sense, I think we'll see a renewed sense of collaboration, which may look eventually like a new supply chain and may change the dynamics fundamentally of the market. But we need to really let all this money that's being invested and all these conflicts play out, the market change, and rebuild the collaborations on a new foundation. And to a large extent, that also depends on the world order, how it will look. And that again links back to how the war in Ukraine will end, and how everyone's position will be in the world. And those will be really the overriding considerations to how our technology ecosystem will end up shaping with all these investments. That's it from my side.
Peter, let me give you my viewpoint. I think in ICs, we always have stress tests. The greater the stress test, the more resilient the ICs are. And I think what we're seeing, the stress test between all this tension, I think is overall good for the market. It may not seem that way right now, but that's what I believe. And I'll give a historical example. I remember in the 1980s, the Greater Semiconductor Alliance was created mainly by US companies. And the positioning was the Japanese is coming, the enemy is coming, the Japanese DRAM industry is coming. We got to be scared of them. What's going to happen, right? What happened in 1984 until they decided to exit the business? And people said, well, what about Micron? Micron was started in the 1980s in that type of backwater place where nobody thought Micron was going to come up. But what were the drivers at the time? The drivers was Sony, I believe, devices drive a semiconductor ecosystem. Sony drove that market in the 1970s. And a company like a lithography company at that time called GCS didn't even bother to give Sony the time of day. And that led to them supporting Nikon and Canon. That led to the formation of Philips spinning out ASML in the 80s to what it is now. Then in the 1980s, Samsung decided, I'm going to go into consumer electronics, later go into semiconductors. That one was another driver. The driver of the Taiwan industry is not only TSMC, but the PC outsourcing that happened with multinationals such as, or later like Compaq, the HPs of the world. So there's always device drivers in it. If you look at China right now, you look at the phone companies there. There's Huawei. Okay, let's say put Huawei aside. There's Xiaomi. There's Oppo, Vivo. There's Transsion. If you look at panels, most panel manufacturing is in China right now. Then you look at the plethora of electric vehicles out there. I mean, arguably, a Tesla manufactured in Shanghai is better produced than the US right now. All those drivers are there. But does that take away from the US? I don't think so. If you look in the 80s and 90s, you saw the rise of Qualcomm. You saw Broadcom. You see NVIDIA. You see the consolidation that later led to Cadence, Synopsys, and I don't know if Mentor is a U.S. company. Let's call it a half of U.S. company because it's German now. Then now you have the SMICs, the Verisilicons of the world in China. Why can't we coexist together? I think it's going to be good for all markets as long as we pass the stress test. That's my viewpoint.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. I think it's great to be able to end on an optimistic note, positive note, a sense of Schumpeterian creative destruction there. So with that, thank you all very much for joining today, taking time out of your Saturdays from across the globe. I think this has been an incredibly informative, insightful panel. And we would, again, thanks for your participation.
Again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And you can stay on stage.